Hello! Overrated books and their underrated counterparts. Let's talk about them. The first book I want to talk about is Common Sense Investing. I think this is a very overrated book. Why? Because it's a very popular book, but what it has to say is actually not much more than what you would expect from like your first year university or college student.
To me, I don't know, PhD, cancer biology scientist. I work in a biotech company. We make COVID-19 testing kits, stuff like that.
The book kind of argues that all you should really do is buy an index fund, hold on to the index fund for 10 years, buy index funds over mutual funds, and then reap the rewards. That's the essence of the book, and to be fair, that's kind of what you would expect from this book, because he has another book where it's like basically about mutual funds, and he loves to talk about the expenses of mutual funds and that mutual funds are good to hold on for the long run. It's nothing really groundbreaking or super insightful, and it's actually not going to teach you a lot about investing. And when you buy a book titled Common Sense Investing, I feel like you kind of want a little bit of like introduction to what like investing really is, and maybe some introduction to stocks or something, but that's not what this book does. And for that reason, it's a bit overrated. A good counterpart for a book like Common Sense Investing, I would argue, is Stocks for Dummies or Investing for Dummies.
You're not just wrong, you're stupid. Now wait just a minute. And you're ugly, just like your mum.
Now the reason why I say these books is because they actually do try to be very simple. It's better than getting like an investing textbook, which is obviously going to ultimately be the better route. But finance is going to involve a little bit of math, unfortunately, and the language of finance is really scuffed. It's really messed up language. All the terms are unnecessarily abstract, I would say. And so it's going to be difficult, but with the Stocks for Dummies or Investing for Dummies, the books will actually teach you how to buy stocks, teach you about different investment strategies. It'll even teach you how to actually analyze the performance of companies so you can tell whether you have a good or bad stock. It will teach you some of these things while keeping it simple. They won't go too much into the math.
Come on, do math.
And that's what's really great about those books. I would say that they're completely insufficient for a complete introduction. I really do think you need a textbook. But as an introduction, I would say those books are better than the Common Sense Investing books. So another book that I'm going to put on here that I've seen this book more frequently than I've seen some of my own books. It is a book that is dragged around like the self-help industry as if it was like a religious text. It's The Secret. The book is called The Secret. And this book is terrible. It parades itself as like kind of like a self-help mix with science, but really it's just pseudoscience. And I've seen a lot of people talk about this thing called the law of attraction, but the law of attraction is just like coincidences or maybe like wishful thinking or availability bias, the availability heuristic, right?
Wow, this is garbage.
Stuff like this. It's not real, at least as far as I can tell. And this book basically does what is really bad about the self-help industry and replaces actual problem solving with good vibes. Rather than actually deal with your problems and give solutions for the difficult problems in your life, you can instead just change your mindset and ignore the problem.
No comment. But yes.
It's a great outlook. An alternative to The Secret would be a book by Epictetus, hippopotamus.
Hippopotamus?
Anyways, this author I like because although you can argue that he might come off as a bit of like just change your mindset and things are gonna get better, you could read him like that. I would argue that what he's really doing is saying that you can't really fix things until you're honest with yourself. And so if you're someone who wants to be mediocre, then be honest that you want to be mediocre. If you're someone who wants to be great, then be honest that you want to be great. and look at what your behaviors are doing, and if your behaviors are not corresponding to those kinds of views. That's kind of his worldview. It's like he wants you to be radically honest with yourself and keep yourself grounded, and he's not really saying that you have to do one thing or another. It's just his emphasis is on honesty. And I think that's a much better alternative to than just simply wishing for good things to happen. Another really, really bad book, or overhyped book, I should say, some people are going to get angry about this because I know a lot of people like this book, is The 4-Hour Workweek. First and foremost, the author of the book, when he was interviewed about the 4-Hour Workweek, admits that he does not work 4 hours. Never in his life did he work 4 hours, he said. On top of that, the business ethics inside the book are a bit questionable. He does want you to outsource every decision in your life to someone who is in a developing economy. On top of that, the marketing of the book, or like the presentation of the book, is kind of like you can get rich and live lavishly without ever doing any work. That's kind of what it comes off as. I don't know, I don't really agree with that. I get that the book is about like lifestyle design, and there are some interesting lessons in the book, but overall the book is overhyped given the quality of the book. Like, what majority of the content inside the book is not nearly as good as, let's say, it doesn't warrant as much hype as it actually has. And for that reason, I think it's overhyped. I also think the book is bad as well, but that's going to be a contentious thing amongst some of the bookstagrammers and booktubers. Now, as an alternative to that book, I really don't have any because I don't look for books that make my life like as easy as possible in that sense. Like, I wouldn't buy a book that says like 4-Hour Workweek. I don't look for that stuff. However, there are books that maybe can suggest alternatives to the advice given. So maybe like Cicero on the Good Life, or Seneca, or Nietzsche, or even Emerson. Emerson has an essay on self-reliance that I'm a big fan of. And some of these books maybe will teach you about being an individual, taking control of things and asserting yourself onto the world, as opposed to being a passive receiver of the demands of others. And so you could argue that being assertive onto the world is another way of doing like lifestyle design. And so I would read those guys rather than the 4-Hour Workweek. But if you want to read the 4-Hour Workweek, go ahead. I don't think you're going to get much out of it. Now, another book that I wanted to suggest to people was, actually, let's talk about this first. Man and His Symbols is a great book, and I've recommended it to people before, but as a self-help book, it is overrated. It is not meant to be a self-help book. It's meant to actually educate people on Jungian psychology. It's more like a popular science book, and probably in Jung's eyes. It's just a general audience book. And people read it as like a self-help tool, which is not fruitful because that's not what it's meant for. And obviously, Jungian psychology is not good for self-help because it's so esoteric. What? A better alternative to this might be Modern Man in Search for a Soul. I haven't read the book yet, but I believe that book is actually more about looking at the psychological problems of modern man. For example, the problems of meaning. I think there's this movement called the meaning crisis movement or whatever that talks about this a lot, and Jung addresses some of those issues. Jung talks about spirituality as it relates to the modern psyche. Those kinds of ideas are probably going to be more useful to you than getting an introduction to Jungian psychology like Man and His Symbols. And so for that reason, I would say Modern Man in Search for a Soul is a better book, or an underrated book in comparison to Man and His Symbols, and is better for your self-help interests. Now, another set of books that have this overrated, underrated dynamic is going to be Your Brain on Music and Joseph Ledoux' Synaptic Self. So I read Your Brain on Music maybe 4 years ago, and the book is so misleading.
We've been duped!
It's like the book is mostly like an introduction to cognitive psychology, and it does go a little bit into music. It talks about how like repetition, we kind of like repetition as humans and stuff like this, but most of the book is an introduction to cognitive psychology, and for that reason the book is like way overrated. It does say it's a New York Times bestseller. I don't know how. I don't think the book is that good. Comparatively, Synaptic Self by Joseph Ledoux is not anywhere near as popular as his other books like Anxious or The Emotional Brain. And that book is actually quite interesting because it talks about, like, for example, how synaptic plasticity has a relationship to the concept of a self. And it even talks about how the structure of memory has a relationship to even the nature of your conscious experiences, which obviously relates back to yourself. He actually incorporates a lot of neuroscience research into a theory of the self. And so he relates brains back to the self. And he doesn't do it in a way that's like too skimp on detail. There's this problem with popular neuroscience books where they cut out on the detail of data and kind of just present an oversimplified theory. Like when people say like dopamine is related to happiness, I think it's a bit of an oversimplified theory. And he doesn't do that. He actually kind of brings in a lot more detail, a lot more chunks. He'll even bring in theories from psychology. He's really good at doing that. And so for that reason, I would recommend reading that book rather than reading Your Brain on Music, which is really just an introduction to cognitive psychology. Now the last combo I want to talk about, which is, I actually don't have a combo for it, I just want to talk about this book, is Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. I like Jordan Peterson. I don't agree with everything he says. I like Jordan Peterson. Beyond Order is an overrated book. I read the book. You've probably seen me talk about it in my last video, and I don't think it's as good as much hype as it gets. So if we put like a bar graph and have like the hype level and like the quality of the book, I think the hype level is higher.
So why didn't I flinch? Because the laws of science differ fundamentally from those of...
Which is just probably, it's more than, that's not really down talking Peterson, that's more like a compliment to his marketing, right? He's obviously very good at getting his message out there. The book, as I said before, doesn't have a lot of originality to it, and what is original is kind of already borrowed from Jungian psychology. I didn't find that there was much new in this book compared to his previous book. I do like some of the insights in the book, like for example that the humans love to impose order, and I don't mind reading some of Peterson's rants and ramblings because he's obviously he's smart, he's educated, right? He's not dumb, as people like to make him seem. Just because you disagree with him doesn't mean he's dumb. He is educated, and so therefore his writing style is a bit enjoyable. He obviously can string together ideas cogently. But the book is not as good as the marketing would make it seem, and for that reason I think it's a little bit overrated. Alternatives to that, I don't know, maybe read some Jung. People have said that Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, is like a mathematical version of this, whereas I think it was Tiago Books on Bookstagram left a comment when I post explaining this. He said, Beyond Order is like looking at chaos using mythology, whereas Anti-Fragile is like looking at chaos using mathematics. I haven't read Anti-Fragile, but that's the kind of distinction he gave, and Tiago's a pretty smart guy, so I think that's probably a correct take. Take with that what you will. I think Beyond Order is overrated. So with that being said, those are some overrated books and their underrated counterparts. If you want me to find a underrated book to a popularly overrated, or that's kind of redundant. If you want me to find a overrated book to a popular book that you read, or if you want me to find a vice versa, let me know in the comment section. I will do that for you. With that being said, tschüss.